Okay, let's go ahead and get started. And as other folks join us, they can just log on in. The voice you're hearing over here is, it's Megan, the Give Local York organizer. And I wanted to thank all of you for joining us today for this webinar about storytelling and donor relations. And it is presented by the lovely Danny Beam, who you see, whose smiling face is there on your screen. Danny from Beam Consulting. We are so lucky and thankful to have her sharing her expertise with us today. I know that you're all going to take a lot from this, whether you're joining us live or whether you're watching this after the fact. So we'll get started here in just a second. As a note, everyone is currently muted. We do have the chat function available if you have questions, and I'll be monitoring that for Danny. And as I understand, there will be a point midway through where we're looking for some audience participation. So we'll unmute you at that point so everyone can chime in. But yeah, so I'm just going to say thank you so much again to Danny. And if you're ready, we're going to go ahead and get started.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And thank you, everyone, for joining me today. And it's delightful to see some familiar names on the list. So hi, guys, that I know from my Fundraising Fellows workshop. What I wanted to do is I wanted to just give you a minute to see my face because I think oftentimes it's helpful to see the person that you're talking to. But in just a bit, I'm going to be sharing my screen with you, and I'll probably take the video off so that you can focus on the materials that I'm presenting on my screen. Before I dive in, I thought you might like to know a little bit about me. So I do own Beam Consulting. I have had my own consulting firm for about 7 years now, and I focus on 2 areas. So capacity building, and with nonprofits, that's usually around fundraising, whether that be helping you augment your existing annual fundraising program or preparing to launch a capital campaign. I usually meet organizations in that space. I also do strategic planning with organizations, and that side of my business, I can do that with either businesses or nonprofits. And I've most often worked with organizations in the strategic planning realm that are using some sort of collective impact model. So it might be that you have your own strategic plan to do, but you have some partners that you're trying to bring into that process with you. So I've done quite a bit of that work as well. I'm delighted to be here today, and I'm delighted to talk to you about storytelling and donor relations, because I believe that the organizations that excel in these areas have a much easier time getting donations from their constituency. So we'll talk about that, and let's get started. I'm gonna take my video off and share my screen, and we'll go through a PowerPoint. Like Megan said, there are going to be some points for participation, and for sure, if you have any questions, please use the chat feature. Megan's gonna be monitoring that so we can stop and address those questions that you have along the way, okay? So what you should be seeing is the PowerPoint, and we will play it from the start. So today we're going to talk about storytelling in donor relations. So we'll start by doing an introduction and overview of exactly what donor relations means and why it's important to your fundraising efforts. We're going to discuss some great donor relations techniques. Then we'll dive more deeply into storytelling and why that is the secret ingredient to all good donor relations. We'll do some work on how to tell a good story, because oftentimes I hear from organizations that they're either not super confident in their storytelling ability, or they don't know which stories make for good stories. So we'll talk about that. There is a tool that came out of the storytelling conference in Seattle, Washington last year called the Story Map. So I'll review that with you because it's a really helpful tool to show you what kind of story you want to use when. Then we'll spend some time talking about how to use this information during Give Local. It's great information to have at all times of the year, but you have this really big event coming up soon. So we'll spend some time talking about how to make this information useful and applicable to your Give Local efforts. And then we'll finish with the Donor Bill of Rights, because donors do have rights, and this document, which comes out of the Association of Fundraising Professionals, is really the guidelines that you should use in your donor relations activities. And then we'll open it up for question and discussion. So that's what we're going to do today. And let's start off first with, what is donor relations and why is it important? Donor relations is a plan that nonprofits design to build relationships with your donors. It's about creating and facilitating high quality interactions or touch points between the donors and the organization. So a lot of times organizations have some touch points or some ways that they interact with donors throughout the year, but it isn't necessarily planned or strategic or mapped out on a calendar on a consistent basis. So when we're talking about donor relations, we're talking about creating a comprehensive strategic plan or guide for all of the ways that you can interact with your donors at all levels of giving throughout the year. Donor relations is really important because it's about ensuring that your donors enjoy interacting with your organization so that they donate more. The next slide is the diagram of the donor engagement cycle. And for those of you that were in my fundraising fellows workshop, I know you've seen this already. So I'll briefly recap. What you have in front of you is the path or cycle that donors go through with your organization. It starts at the top, at the first point of contact, the first time they are introduced to your organization. If they like what they see, they move into the stage called cultivation, where they are getting to know more about your organization and you're getting to know more about them. It then moves in, and during that cultivation time, you're really learning about each other. So if you're doing good cultivation, you're starting to learn what motivates their giving. If they have a particular interest in a program that you offer, you're learning about the resources that they have to be generous. So their assets, what they can give to you. And you use all of that information to get to the point where you ask them to make a donation. After you ask, and hopefully they say yes, you want to thank and recognize or acknowledge their generosity. Depending on the size of the gift, that can be public or private. And then after you thank them, you want to keep in good touch with them and continue to demonstrate the impact of their donation. This cycle is really important, and it's critical to the donor relations aspect, because when you look at the cultivation, acknowledgement, and stewardship sections, anything that you do during that section is really a donor relations activity. And what you have in those moments is the points at which donors are determining whether or not they want to give to you again. So for example, if you do a really good job cultivating someone and you ask them and they say yes, but you don't thank them appropriately and you don't tell them how their gift made a difference and you don't stay in touch with them in artful ways, they're going to be less likely to give to you again. Conversely, you can have a really, really great acknowledgement and stewardship process. You could have some really great activities to that, but if you don't go back and start cultivating them again or start prepping them for the next ask, you're going to miss an opportunity to get another donation. So it's really important that you lean into those other areas of the cycle, not just the asking part. When I work with organizations, especially if I'm dealing with board members, I often hear that they're afraid of the ask, that they don't want to ask people for money. And the good news is that that's probably the least critical element of the cycle. If you do the cultivation and stewardship and acknowledgement really well, and then you can use your board members and volunteers in those areas, asking is going to be much easier. And there's research that shows that board members and volunteers who are involved in the non-ask portions of the cycle help organizations generate a lot of loyalty among their donors and often increase the gifts that are given without even asking for more money. It's just because you're taking such good care of them. So elsewhere on the cycle, you'll see the note that gratitude is the most important piece. So the more you can thank and acknowledge your donors, the more they feel like they are really making a difference for your organization and they feel valued. All of that stuff that I just talked about, using the other aspects of the cycle and leaning in there, that's called the ask between the ask. And again, it's during those other times in the cycle that donors are deciding whether or not to give to you again. Many of you are familiar with the donor pyramid, and that is a simple infographic that's used to explain that at the bottom of the pyramid, gifts are usually smaller and happen more frequently. Here, you can think of annual appeals, maybe some events, something that's crowd-funded, but small gifts that you can ask for more often. And so this cycle of cultivation, acknowledgement, and stewardship happens fairly rapidly within a few months' time if the gifts are smaller. If you're dealing with a major donor, someone who's giving several thousands of dollars, for that individual, this cycle could take much longer. And so you have more opportunities during a 2-year period of time, for example, to do different elements of donor relations to help cultivate those gifts. And last, the bigger the donor or the bigger the gift, the more personalized this cycle becomes. And again, when it comes to donor relationships, it's the more personal the activities are for that specific donor, because in theory, you know that individual or that business really, really well, and you can tailor your approach to the things that are most interesting to them. I'm gonna step out of the big screen option because I feel like I'm missing out on some potential chat stuff. So I'm just gonna check real quick and make sure that I'm not missing out on anything. And it looks like we're good to go. Okay. So when we talk about great donor relations techniques, the thing to keep in mind is that they are always mission aligned. So for example, if you want to have an event that will draw a lot of people in, you want to make sure that that event is focused on your mission. So if you are, for example, an arts organization, you might consider doing a paint and sip night as opposed to a golf scramble, because what does golf actually have to do with your artistic mission? Which isn't to say I'm anti-golf in any way, but I am trying to highlight that the things that you do want to reinforce the mission that you are executing in the world, and they should all be aligned. So another example would be if you are an organization that is dealing with hunger, you might think about giving an opportunity to have donors provide food products to your organization that you can distribute, as opposed to blankets, because you're not necessarily dealing with homelessness and that kind of issue. So you might not want to accept blankets, you might want to accept food products that you can help distribute with your mission. Good donor relations techniques are also really creative. So the more that you can add an element of creativity or surprise to your touch points throughout the year, the more interested and delighted your donors will be. So I know it can often be tricky to come up with creative ideas, especially when nonprofits and staff are so busy. The more you can do that, however, the more you will stand out from the crowd and really delight your donors. Great donor relations techniques are also appropriate to the level of giving. So for example, you wouldn't want to give a gift to someone that's given $5. So for example, you wouldn't want to do a plaque of best donor ever for a $5 donation. Conversely, you wouldn't want to fail to publicly acknowledge or provide some special recognition to a donor that's given you $1 million. If someone gives you $1 million, a gift acknowledgement letter, that tax letter that goes out after a gift is made is not an appropriate response to a gift of that size. So the trick when it comes to donor relations is having a plan that really is appropriate for all levels of giving. So you have multiple ways that you're thanking and stewarding donors throughout the year that are different for different size gifts. Ideally, anything that you do is also replicable. So it's not a one-off activity, and it's easy enough for you to implement over and over again, because it leads to that last point, which is great donor relations techniques are consistent. The more you can be consistent in how you talk to your donors, the more the donors get used to hearing from you in that way and are prepped and primed to respond to whatever you're asking them to do. If a donor makes a gift to you, and I had this happen to me one time, if you make a donation and you never hear from them, never even get a gift acknowledgement letter, you're going to think that they don't care. And then if that organization 6 months down the road sends you this email saying that I'm a very valued donor and they can't do things without me, I'm not going to believe them because they didn't thank me for my gift in the first place. So you want to make sure that whatever you're doing is consistent and you can do it. It's easy enough for you to do over and over again, so that the donors can rely on you. The more you practice this approach, the more they will begin to trust you as an organization. Here's where I want to unmute us for a moment and see if there are any questions about what I've discussed so far, and also talk about some ways that your organizations are doing these different touch points throughout the years. If there are any creative or fun ideas, I'd like the group to share. So
I know I did like 20 the other day. That was the other day.
We are unmuted.
Yeah.
Great.
You know, I print out those 30-day challenge things every month that Rebecca sends. I have them all. I haven't done none of them. But I have all the papers.
Yeah.
I'm not good at committing.
So who's talking right now?
Yeah.
Does anyone have any questions on what I've shared so far? And does anyone have any things that they do in terms of thanking and stewarding or cultivating their donors that you'd like to share with the group?
I'll hop in, Danny. This is Megan.
Hi, Megan.
Hi. When I was with Downtown Inc., the Main Street organization for downtown York, I was their Chief Marketing and Development Officer, and we had launched a new development approach that we called our Friends campaign. So what we put in place, we tried to think of things that were sort of easy lifts for us, again, that were consistent, easy to do, but making sure we were recognized for their gifts. So immediately as a gift came in, I had a box of thank you for being our friend postcards that I kept nearby. And I just on a daily basis would shoot a quick personal note to them. And that was something that we could send out really quickly, that postcard, because our, official sort of tax, for tax purpose recognition letters took a little bit longer to go out. So I wanted them to have an immediate thank you from me. So we sent those postcards out immediately saying, thank you for being our friend with a personal message. We also had regular Thank You Thursday posts on the Downtown Inc. Facebook page, where every week we would recognize one or two donors for their donations, for being supporters, for being friends. So there were some regular pieces that we had in place. And then several times throughout the year, we had donor-only or friends-only type special events. And usually they were kind of behind the scenes tours of buildings like the Yorktown Hotel or like the Lighthouse Project, taking advantage of resources we had available to us that we thought, you know, might make for a nice out of the ordinary kind of experience for folks to show value to them for being supporters of us. So those are some things we did at Downtown Inc.
Those are some great examples. I love the thank you card that goes out right away. And that reminds me, so I'm actually in Lancaster and have participated quite a bit in Lancaster's version of Give Local, which is called Extra Give. And a number of my clients have taken to doing a thankathon sort of ahead of the event itself, so that before an organization is asked for money during the Extra Give activity, they hear from the organization by getting a thank you call from a board member or volunteer. And so it's been a fun way for the organizations that have done it to one, involve their board and volunteers in the process, and two, make sure that the donors have another opportunity to hear that their gift makes a difference before they're asked to give another gift. So thanks for that, Megan. Are there other fun ideas or activities that you guys do? Okay, moving on then. So let's talk about storytelling for a little bit. So fundraising really is storytelling. And the reason why storytelling is so important to donor relations is because it provides that emotional connection for the donor to your work. So most organizations, when they think they're communicating, whether it's on Facebook or in a newsletter or in a direct mail appeal, they're usually communicating content. They're not always telling stories. So for an example, content would be some statistics about the homeless problem in your community, or content would be the list of activities that you do to address domestic violence or to help find jobs for people. A story is that story about the person that was homeless and you helped them find housing. A story is about that individual or group of people who move from experiencing some sort of trauma to using art to help tell the story of their trauma and process that in a safe way. So storytelling is really important because it's how donors can connect to your mission, and they generate emotion and they build connection and they drive action. If you think for a minute about your own experience hearing a good story, what's more effective for you? Is it more effective that you receive a lot of statistics, or is it more effective if you hear the story of a person that really tugs on your heartstrings and makes you want to do something? The other reason why storytelling is so important is because humans have an attention span of 7 seconds. And if you can start off a conversation by telling a story, a good story will grab someone's attention within that 7 seconds and hold their attention span for longer. If you just start talking at them, they tend to lose their focus, and you lose your opportunity to connect with them in a real way. Your stories should always have some sort of call to action, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's a call to give money. So because stories are so emotional and they can really prompt a response for people, you always want to give your audience an opportunity to respond in an appropriate way, or a call to action, so that they can move or act on those feelings or that experience they're having in the moment. And by using that call to action, you're developing a deeper relationship with your donor, which means ultimately you'll be able to come back and ask them for a more sizable donation or to give again. So storytelling is really important to fundraising. So let's talk a little bit about how to tell a good story. So first of all, I've often heard people say, I'm not really a very good storyteller, or I don't know the kind of story that I should be telling, or what we really need is an elevator pitch, that 60-second elevator pitch. I've heard so many board members saying we need that, and we can't talk to our donors without that elevator pitch. And none of that is really true. So first of all, you don't have to be an expert storyteller to tell a story. And it can be a little uncomfortable for you, but it doesn't mean that it's wrong. It just means that you might need more practice, or that the story that you're telling is a hard story to tell. And when it comes to the elevator pitch, the best elevator pitch is rooted in the individual person telling it. So it's their personal story about they give. So the way to address some of that anxiety around storytelling is to by first start generating a list of content, a log of story content. So if you are working within your organization and have team meetings, start those meetings by asking the staff or the program staff to share a story and write those down, and start building a repertoire of stories that you can draw on when you need them. If you're at a board meeting, start the board meeting with a story, a mission moment, and start keeping track of those so that you can revisit them and use them again. You get bonus points if you ask the board members to tell the story. So it's not always the staff that are telling the story, but the board members are showing up too. The second way to tell a good story is by always matching it with the point that you're trying to make. So for example, if you're meeting with a donor, or if you're asking for money in an appeal letter, and you have a point to make about why the gift is important, you want to tell a story that shows how that gift is important. And so when you're meeting with the donor, if you want to have a conversation talking about why a new program is necessary, you want to come prepared to tell a story about how there's someone in your community that's not being served because you don't have that program in place yet. So that you tell a good story and you tie it to a point that you're trying to make. Practicing the stories always makes them better, but you don't have to be perfect when you tell the story. The more authentic you are in the moment, the more the donors will trust that the story that you're telling is true and that it's important to you. You also want to use good story structure when you're telling a story. So by story structure, I mean that you want to have a clear moral to the story or purpose to the story. There's a reason why you're telling the story to the audience at this time. You want to have a personal connection. So the story either involves you or someone you feel connected to. And you want common reference points. So that means that the audience understands the context or the situation of the story. So for example, it wouldn't make much sense if you were an organization that is dealing with peacemaking and mediation to start telling a fishing story unless you could clearly explain the context of that story about fishing in the broader scope of work that you're trying to communicate about. Good stories have a lot of detail to the characters and imagery. You're painting a word picture for your audience. So you want that story to have enough visual description so that you can see what you're seeing. That's easier to do when you're writing a story in a communication piece, but you can also do that when you're talking to a donor or another person in your community. The more you can paint the picture, the more you can really describe the characters in the story, the more the audience will walk with you through that story. Also important is you want to have conflict, vulnerability, or achievement that's relatable. So it's similar to having a good moral or purpose, but you also really want this story to be relatable to the audience. And it's okay if it's your personal story to exhibit vulnerability in the telling it, or to talk about how there's a happy ending or there's an achievement. And conflict is the source of all good stories. So if you think about the books you've read, the best books have, you know, quite a lot of conflict or tension in the narrative that the protagonist has to address in order to come out of the other side. The same is true for telling a story to your donors. And then pacing. You want a clear beginning, ending, and segue back to the topic. So when it comes to telling a good story, you want to make sure that it doesn't go on too long and it's not too short. And you want people to know where they are in the process of the story all along the way. So you want it to be clear to them that they're at the beginning of the story, or they're in the middle of it, or that they're coming to the end and they'll hear the resolution. So pacing your stories will be important as well. I'm going to stop here again and just check in and see if anyone has any questions about that material, or if there are any good examples that the group can share with one another on how they've used stories in their organization.
Danny, we did have Annette chime in the chat, who talked about ways that they thank their donors in creative ways. And this might be tying in a little bit to the storytelling aspect, is for the Spring Grove Area Scholarship Fund, they have an awards banquet each year, and they actually have their scholarship donors sit with the student that will be awarded their scholarship. So I think that's a really cool way to add that personal touch, and to also allow their donors to see directly and speak with, you know, tangibly the people who are benefiting from their gift. They also have the students who receive the scholarships send a personal card and letters then to the donors to continue to follow up with them. So that's sort of an ongoing storytelling and allowing them to meet the beneficiary of their gifts.
Yeah, and I love, what a great way to make it personal and keep that relationship going, so it's constantly in front of the donor that they're affecting the lives of this actual human being, and not just this like vague notion of helping people, but it's a very concrete way of tying their donation to the work that's being done. That's awesome. I'm curious, in a wave of hands, or if we could take a quick poll, how many of you think that you do a good job telling your story? And if you think you do, just say I do or we do in the chat. Sometimes we don't tell it enough. Yeah. How many of you think that no one in your community knows what you do, or very few people know what you do, or not enough people know what you do? I get that a lot when I'm working with organizations too. It's an art that gets better with repetition. Yeah, that's great, Ted. And you're not done. So I often hear from organizations that and in fact, I'm a board member of an organization here in Lancaster, and I was just part of a conversation at a development committee meeting where the CEO was saying, no one in the community knows what we do. No one in the community is aware of all the services that we have to offer. And I asked that question because I think with Give Local, you guys have a really good opportunity in front of you to do some storytelling and promotion around the work that you do. And so I know Megan's been working on some marketing materials for you guys, and I know that you're getting a lot of training leading up to that. But I think this is a really, really good opportunity for you to amplify your voice in the community and get in front of people and more people than you have before. So I'm excited for you. And in a minute, we're going to talk about how to craft some stories that map to where you are in the process. But I wanted to also ask that question because, one, you're not alone. So lots of organizations think that they need to do better storytelling, and it is hard to tell those stories consistently and in a way that feels fresh, even though you're doing it over and over again. Okay, so this is a tool. Yep. This is a tool called the, somehow I just muted myself. Oop, sorry, I accidentally just muted myself. Okay. This is, okay. This is what's called the story spine. So I wanted you to have this document because this is a formula that you can use to tell stories. So, and after the training in the follow-up materials, you're going to get a resource list, and on the resource list is a link to a blog that further unpacks this diagram in front of you, so you have instructions on how to use it. But every good story starts with a beginning, some catalytic event that happens to break the routine, and then the consequences of that event that happen over and over again, sometimes multiple consequences that lead to some sort of change, the climax. So something that the character does to either embark on success or failure. And then the denouement, or the end, or the outcome of that climax is what happens after that. So if you think about the stories that you're trying to tell in your organization, I bet that they can flow in this way, and you can use this spine to craft the stories that you want to tell about the work that you're doing. This is a really useful tool during the Give Local process, because as you start communicating about Give Local, and as you start to rally your donors and constituents around you and begin to cultivate them so that they give, you want to be able to tell stories about why it's important. So you can use this story spine in a number of different ways. You could use this story spine to tell the story of your organization. So once upon a time, our founder had an idea that they should go have a women's organization that was teaching life skills to women. And so they went and they talked to a number of community members, and the community members liked that. And as a result, they tried a number of different things, and there was success or failure. And eventually our organization was formed. So you can use that as an example to tell the story of your organization. You can also use the story spine to tell the story about the people that you serve or the work that you're doing. You can use the story spine to tell the story about the donors. So, for example, if you were to tell the story about once upon a time, our organization was looking for donors to give during Give Local, and you can tell the story of what it would look like for a donor to participate in this event. But I find this spine to be really useful and really flexible because you can use it for a number of different characters in your organization's fold. Side note, there's this thing called the disruptive character in storytelling, and a disruptive character is someone that is unusual. So someone you might not consider as the regular protagonist in the story. They're, for example, if you told the story from the donor's perspective about getting involved in Give Local, that might feel a little unusual or disruptive. I've had some clients use a character of, one client used the character of a pen and how that pen was used throughout the day, and told the story of the work that the organization was doing from the perspective of the pen that was being used. So there are ways that you can get creative with the spine and the characters that you choose in order to tell your story. And here again, I'd like to take a minute to just pause, because whenever I'm doing trainings, I like to give people the opportunity to apply some of the stuff that we're talking about in the moment, so that you can take it and run with it when you leave. So I'd like you to just take a moment and maybe think about some of the characters that you could use in telling your story. And if you want to put them in the comments, just very briefly, just do a quick brainstorm, and we can see what some great ideas come from that. Okay, moving on. So let's talk now about which story to use when. So what you have here is called the story map. And this, like I mentioned earlier, came from the storytelling conference in Seattle, Washington last year. A link to this map and a 30-minute video on how to use this map is also included in the resource guide. So we'll talk about it a little bit here right now, but if you want more information, do check out that link, because it will be much more thorough than what we're going to do right now. But in order to use the story map, which is basically what story to use when, you first want to start with your audience. Who's the donor, or who's the person that you're talking to? And hopefully you know that donor well enough to know the appropriate channel. So is it during a face-to-face meeting? Are you going to send them an email? Are you going to have a group presentation? But choose that communication channel. Maybe it's Facebook. And then you want to decide, you want to make the attraction the story asks. So you want to determine whether that's what call to action you want to do. So whether the purpose of the story is to get a gift, or is to get some volunteer time or some expertise, or to ask them to share the information about your organization to their broader network. You want to determine what that is. And you also want to determine where you are in the process. So here is a critical tool on knowing which story to use when. So if you are at the beginning of the process with the donor, you want to tell a future tense story. So you will want to tell a story about what would be happening if they made a donation. So for example, if I were talking to someone about the organization where I'm a board member and I'm asking them to consider making a gift, I would say, Joe, if you make a gift, we will be able to help X, Y, and Z people find housing. So it's a future tense, it's sort of promising that their gift will make a difference in the future. If they're in the process of making the gift, or if they've just recently made the gift, you want to have the story that you tell be present tense. So you want it to say, Joe, thank you so much for making that gift. That gift is helping X, Y, and Z people find housing today. So it's the thing that's happening in the moment. As you continue to steward them, you want to show the ongoing nature of the effects of their gift. So that's actually a past tense story. So Joe, the gift that you made last year made it possible for X, Y, and Z people. They've been in their housing for the past 5 months. So when you're at the beginning of the conversation, you want your story to talk about the future effect or the future impact that the donation will have. After the gift is made, or when they're in the moment of making that gift, you want the story to reflect what's happening today that's making a difference, that their gift is making a difference in accomplishing. And then if you want to continue to report to them, you want to talk about past tense. So the gift that they made in the past made this effect happen in the past that continues to have ripple effects. So that's the first line, or the first series of the story map. So the boxes that determine the ideal donor, the arrows that go straight down the left side of the page. The big blue box, the engagement story, the segmentation story series, and the re-engagement stories, those are activities that you want to do if you're trying to either re-engage someone who's lapsed or engage new people. So the engagement story is something that you want to create. For example, if someone has lapsed, you want to remind them of their past gifts and how that was a difference, and you want to find stories that are really captivating that would help re-engage their attention in your organization. And ideally, you would be even more particular in the stories that you're using for different audiences, because it's harder to capture people's attention once you've lost it. So that story that you're telling has to be really tailored to that particular individual or group of individuals to re-engage their attention. And then you want to reinforce that by telling more and more stories to just hold their attention over and over again. So that's the re-engagement story series that you have over there. And then once they're re-engaged, you can go back and make an ask and use the process on the first side or on the left side of the page. Now I want to talk a little bit about how to use this information during Giving Local. So it's great to have all this information, and hopefully these ideas around stories and donor relations can be useful to you at any time during the year. But I really want to make sure that you have the information that you need so that you can get the most out of Give Local possible. So if you haven't already, I would invite you to create at least 3 stories using the story map that you can share during the promotion, the day of, and follow up on Give Local. So you want to write 1 story and use the story spine that talks about the future impact of the donations that are made that day. You want a second story that you can share during the day that Give Local is happening, so that as gifts are made, you can talk about the stuff that's going to be done or the stuff that you're doing with the gifts, the results that day. And then when you follow up after Give Local, you want to talk about the impact of that generosity from Give Local and how the ripple effects are moving through your organization. So I would recommend creating at least 3 different stories that you can use, 1 leading up to Give Local, 1 the day of, and 1 to follow up. What I've seen a lot of organizations do here in Lancaster is that they have, like I mentioned earlier, there's a thankathon or sort of a phone banking thing that their board members do to reach out and thank board members where board members thank donors and tell stories leading up to it. Sometimes they choose to, instead of calling people, sending emails or writing handwritten notes, any touch point that's basically an expression of gratitude, not an ask before Give Local, is really helpful. Tell the story then. And then they also have another communication piece or 2 where they're basically priming the pump, so to speak, or they're sort of announcing that in the coming weeks, you will be participating in Give Local, and that's another opportunity to tell a story about your organization and the people that you serve, to again remind the donors why Give Local is important and the impact that their participation in this day will have on your organization. Having sometimes as many as 5 to 7, but I don't think that's necessary, but having a few emails, Facebook posts, videos that go out during the day to update the amount of, to report on the amount of donations you've received so far, tell another story about your organization, and start thanking the people that are participating helps to generate momentum, but also reminds people that the day is 24 hours and it's still ongoing. And then the follow-up, that story or those series of touch points that you have after the day should be prompt and should be very celebratory, and thank the people that participate, especially since this is the first time that you are engaged in this as a community. Another really helpful thing to do after Give Local is have 3 future contact points or interactions already identified. So as you're thinking about how to get the most out of this day, the stuff that you do after the day can be as impactful as the stuff you do leading up to it or the day of. So I recommend that there are at least 3 different either activities or communication pieces that you plan to disseminate within the next 30 to 60 days from Give Local. It would be really great if there's some event or activity that you have that you can take the participants in Give Local and invite them to not long after, because that'll help keep them engaged. You can also at that event tell the story of what happened during Give Local and thank them there. So again, it's that donor relations plan that extends beyond the event itself. And we already talked about using your board members and volunteers to express thanks, but I just wanted to highlight that again because it's actually really, really important. There is a woman named Penelope Burke, who is a fundraising researcher, and her fundraising has shown that the more that board members and volunteers are involved in thanking donors, the more donors are likely to stay with organizations or give larger gifts in the future. So this is where it really does take a village, and especially for something like an event like this day, to use your board members and involve them in the process. If you can get your board members to tell their story on Facebook or through emails to donors on why they support your organization and why they serve as board members, that would be an additional value add that hopefully wouldn't be too difficult for them to do, especially if you give them the story spine. So we are coming to the end of our PowerPoint, and then I want to open it up for questions and conversation. But before we do that, here's the Donor Bill of Rights. So this was formed by the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and the website to that organization is also going to be on the resource list. But there are certain things that donors can expect from organizations, and you can use this as a guide for how you treat gifts to your organization. So first of all, they have a right to be informed of your mission and the way the organization tends to use donated resources and your capacity to use the donations effectively for their intended purposes. So basically what that's saying is they should be able to feel confident that if they give a gift, you're going to use it in the way that you say you're going to use it, and that not only that you plan to use it that way, but you also have the means and the wherewithal to do what you say you're going to do. Donors have a right to be informed of the identity of those serving on the organization's governing board and to expect the board to exercise prudent judgment in its stewardship responsibilities. More increasingly, donors are not willing to just trust that organizations are doing good work. They're looking for more and more data that reinforces that you are credible and do what you say you're going to do. So transparency at the board level is a really important way to build trust with donors, and they should be able to see who is on your board especially in a small community like York, that's really important. So if you haven't already, I would encourage you to list your board members in either your annual report or on your website or in your other communications pieces so that they know who's leading this organization. They should have a right to your most recent financial statements. They can get your 990 whether you give it to them or not. But for sure, your financial information should be included in your annual report and should be accessible to the donors if they ask, since they are helping to support your financial situation. They should be assured that their gifts will be used for the purposes for which they were given. So oftentimes donors like to restrict gifts to a particular program, especially grantors often have gift restrictions in the grants that they award, and organizations should not deviate from that purpose unless they've already talked to the donor and approved a change. So for example, I worked with an organization one time where a donor made a $10,000 gift to help buy a piece of machinery. They found out 3 or so months after that piece of machinery wasn't going to be needed, but they were also facing a budget crunch where it looked like they were going to come in a little short at the end of the year, and the $10,000 would help them it would go a long way to help them meet their budget. So what they did was they sat down with the donor and explained the situation and said, look, it turns out we don't need this piece of machinery in the way that we thought. We do, however, have this gap in our budget for this year. Can we shift your gift from purchasing this equipment to our operating fund to help close the budget? And the donor said yes. And then he also said that he was really grateful that the organization was transparent and communicated that to him. For him, it felt really good to know that the organization was honest in that way and was also taking into consideration the donor's intent. So it worked out really well for them. So if you get a gift and it's restricted, you should use it for that purpose. If for some reason you can't, you absolutely should have a conversation with that donor and ask permission to move the gift over before doing it. Donors have the right to receive appropriate acknowledgement and recognition. We talked about that earlier. They have a right to be informed whether those seeking donations are volunteers, employees, or the hired solicitors. One thing that you guys might not know, but it's important for you to know, is in Pennsylvania, if you are a hired solicitor, so if you are working with someone like me, a consultant that does fundraising, people like me need to be registered with the state, and there are certain hoops that we need to go through in order to be aligned with the state requirements. So there is language in the contracts that I use that has to be there for the state's purposes, and any contract that I make with an organization needs to go to the state for approval. So that's one way that you all are protected from using solicitors. Another thing, hired solicitors. Another thing that you should know, if you don't already, is that no consultant or hired solicitor should be paid by a commission or a percentage of the funds raised. So that's actually unethical according to the Association of Fundraising Professionals ethical standards. And so if you have someone, a consultant or someone that's wanting to do freelance fundraising for you, and they say that they will accept a commission or a percentage of the funds raised, don't work with that person, because that's not ethical. And so I mentioned that to you in case you didn't know that as an organization, but also because if you're dealing with donors, the donors have a right to know who is asking them for money. They have a right to the opportunity for their names to be deleted from mailing lists that an organization may intend to share. I don't actually recommend that you share your mailing lists, like the sale of mailing lists or the sharing of them is really sketchy. So I wouldn't recommend that they are shared with other organizations or entities. But if you do, before you share that list, you should run it by your donors and see if they want their names removed. I made the mistake of making a donation to the political party I support, and it feels like the worst decision I have ever made, because I made a donation to a local candidate, and they sold my name on a list to the national party, and I'm getting calls daily, even though I've repeatedly been asked to be removed from any mailing list because they shared my information. So I've been ragey about it ever since, and I won't make a political party donation ever again. So I tell that story to you as a cautionary tale to not share information with other people. Last, they have a right to ask questions when making a donation and receive prompt, truthful, and forthright answers. They're making an investment in your organization, and it's really important that you do what you need to do to make sure that they feel comfortable making the decision that you're asking them to make. Donors have a right to be assured that information about their donation is handled with respect and confidentiality to the extent provided by law. That's fairly self-explanatory, but most donors, unless they tell you otherwise, don't really want the details of their philanthropy to be spread. So be mindful that their information is kept confidential within your organization. And last, they have a right to expect that all relationships with the individuals representing the organizations will be professional in nature. So again, they should be, your staff, which I'm sure they are already, should be able to represent your organization professionally in interactions with donors. We covered a lot of ground in a fairly short amount of time. I'd like to stop now, stop talking, and open it up for questions or comments from the group. And I think we can unmute at this point if people just want to chime in.
Great, we are all unmuted.
Great. So what questions do you have for me? And it can be about this content and the PowerPoint, or it can be about other aspects of Give Local. Like I said, I've been really, really involved in Lancaster's Extra Give, and I have a lot of clients that I've worked with leading up to and during that process. So I'm happy to address anything that might be top of mind for you.
Okay. Danny, do you have your contact information on one of the slides, or I can share it out if someone maybe thinks of something afterwards, or maybe has a more sort of customized question that they would want to ask you offline?
I should do. It's on the resource guide. Oh, actually, I wanted to go through that real quickly too. My website is there, and there's a contact mechanism on my website for people to reach me. You can also email me directly at Dani, D-A-N-I, at DannyBeam.com. But wow. Let me get the resource guide because I want to review that with you guys real quick. And give it a minute. Okay, so I listed some books and websites that have some resources for you. So there's my blog at the top of the list, but that also drives you to my website, so you can reach me there, or you can use the email that I just mentioned. Northwest Nonprofit Notes is an online magazine that I contribute to, and it's because I'm part of a collaborative of consultants in Seattle. So you'll find lots of good articles and resources there from a variety of different writers about board development, hiring, fundraising, events, all sorts of different things. So I refer you there. If you don't know about it already, the Chronicle of Philanthropy is an excellent resource. And I found a list of articles that are specially devoted to donor relations. So that's the second link under that bullet point there, that'll just take you to a whole list of articles on donor relations. The link to the Association of Fundraising Professionals is there. That is the fundraising body that sets the ethical standards for fundraising throughout the country. So it's full of great resources, and they have done many books and white papers and other resources that are free or low cost. So they have a whole library that you can access and download there. Seth Godin does quite a bit on marketing and communications, and he has a fun blog, so I included in there. One of the books that I rely on very heavily when it comes to donor relations is Janet Hedrick's book, and that is a really useful tool. It's actually published by the AFP. And there's a checklist in that book on your donor relations strength. So if you are looking for a way to evaluate how you're doing in this arena, she has an excellent checklist and basically a test that you can take. 7 Faces of Philanthropy and The Artful Journey are classic fundraising books that help talk a little bit more about artful touch points. And then the 7 Faces of Philanthropy basically addresses 7 donor archetypes and how you want to relate to them to maximize their giving. Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, is a great book that basically says, you know, to get to the root of everything, to get people to do what you want them to do, you need to start with why you're asking them to do it. He also has a TED Talk that you can Google. The story spine that's in the PowerPoint, how to use it, there's more detail at that link. There's the Start With Why TED Talk that I gave. And then the Danger of a Single Story TED Talk was really excellent, and I encourage you guys to read it, because if we're talking about stories, there's a caution about only telling the same story over and over again, and by only telling the same story, you miss out on reaching new audiences. So that's a really useful TED Talk, and it was very interesting and engaging. The Movie Mondays is a free weekly video that I would encourage everyone to sign up for. It's on fundraising and board development, and they're usually less than 10 minutes long, and they show up in your inbox. On Mondays, this week's was about how to not be afraid to make the ask. And then last, the storytelling sequence video, so that diagram that I shared with you, that's the video that explains that more thoroughly. So if you have any questions there. So that will be coming in the follow-up materials. And then my email and phone number is at the bottom of the page.
Perfect. Well, if no one has any further questions for Danny here, like she mentioned, we will be sending out her resource list. You'll have access to her slide deck. We also recorded today's session, so we'll be sending that information out as well. But I want to say thank you so much to Danny for sharing your time and talents with us this afternoon. Really appreciate this insight. I think this is going to be really helpful for everybody, not only for May 4th, but for their fundraising efforts beyond Give Local York. So this was just wonderful, and I want to say thank you so much.
Great. I was happy to share it. There are more resources than the resource guide I just gave you. I have a couple other articles and things that'll show up in the follow-up email. So be on the lookout for that. And please do feel free to reach out if you have any questions. I'd be happy to help you. I really am excited that York is doing this, and I want you guys to be successful. So I'm happy to be online if you have any questions. So thanks for the time today, everyone. I hope this was useful, and I wish you the best as you prep for Give Local.
Thanks so much, Danny, and thank you everyone for participating today. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Thank you.